Finally, let's get started here. Let me turn things over to our keynote speaker, Norm Ornstein. For those of you who may be attending the conference for the first time, let me summarize Norm's very lengthy and impressive bio by saying that he is not. He's been here for many years, and we're so thankful that he's here again to provide his perspective and commentary, something that he does regularly for CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and other similarly minor bit players in the national and international media landscape. Norm, thank you for being here. What can the leaders with us today expect from policymakers in the coming year?
Thanks so much, Christoph. And I'm, of course, delighted to be back for, I think it's 26, maybe 27 years that I've done this. 3 weeks ago, we had an auspicious date, February 2nd, which is 2/2/22, one of those days that comes along every 11 years or so. Yesterday was a date that we won't see again for another 90 years, 2/22/22. And it prompted me just simply to tell a cautionary story I've told before. I apologize for those who've heard it, that I first told on 8/8/88. That takes place on May the 5th, 1955, 5/5/55. It's about an accountant who couldn't sleep that evening, restless, finally early in the morning, got up and said, yeah, this is crazy. I might as well go into the office and finish an audit I've been working on. Looked out his window. There was a bank building with a neon sign flashing time and temperature. It was 5:55 in the morning, 55 degrees. He went to his office, which was at the corner of 5th Avenue and 55th Streets, up on the 55th floor. And sure enough, finished his audit. It showed $5,555,555 on each side of the ledger. He broke his pencil, threw it against the wall, said, that's it, raced down to the bank and withdrew his life savings, $5,555, hailed a cab and said, take me to Aqueduct, the race course, mid-afternoon, a balmy day. A long trip out to Long Island, but remember it's 1955, so the cab fare was only $5.55. Very crowded at Aqueduct, but he muscled his way through to an open window, put down the money and said, I want all of this on number 5 in the 5th. And then he went down to the apron as he watched as the 5th race took place and the horses came around the track. He was breathless and they crossed the finish line. And of course, his horse finished 5th. Now, I say that because we should be very careful of linear projections here as we look to the events ahead in what is an enormously tumultuous time in America and around the world. I'm going to take a couple of minutes just to talk about a couple of the long-term factors here and then look a little bit at the short term and project ahead. One, of course, which we've talked about regularly over the last few years, is the tribalism in our political arena and frankly across the society now. It's not simply about polarization. You can be polarized and still find ways to work together. Tribalism is where you view large numbers of your fellow citizens as evil and trying to destroy your way of life. And it now dominates our politics, our media at so many levels. And it's particularly pronounced in many ways on a Republican side, where the tribalism has had elements of a cult. So even now, as we look at recent surveys, half of all self-proclaimed Republicans in the country, self-identified Republicans, believe that Trump had nothing to do with the events on January 6th. We still have somewhere between 60 and 70% of Republicans who say that Trump won the election. 60% of Republicans say that won't say that Biden definitely won. And over a third of Republicans say that violence would be appropriate if elected leaders don't act to protect America. These are troubling things. There are no angels here, but it's a sign of where we are. And obviously, we see this playing out across the widest range of issues. I'll talk more about the health care front and COVID, but we see it now, of course, even with Ukraine and Russia. Now, along with the tribalism, we know that we have a very serious and deep geographical and regional divide in the country. It's not simply about red states versus blue states, although that's obviously a factor. It's about the urban areas and the rest of the country, and particularly rural areas, where the economic growth is taking place dramatically in those large urban areas, the cities and the inner ring of suburbs. And as you move further out, you see economic dislocation, social dislocation, dramatic political divides as well. Democrats have a particularly deep challenge in the rural areas. A recent book by Alec McGillis points this out in particular, but we see it in many places. And of course, it's exacerbated by the historic and continuing racial divide in the country. And of course, we also still have economic inequality at a substantial level that has its impact on political attitudes. Now, short term, COVID fatigue is an enormously significant factor surrounding our politics and the healthcare system as well. But we cannot, I think, underestimate the broader impact on the national psyche of what is now going on 3 years of having to deal with the pandemic. And what we saw in the second year, as it looked like perhaps we were coming out of it, we could restore normality. Then Delta hits, followed by Omicron. And the simple sense, the sense of distemper and frustration that we've had these disruptions in people's lives and in the schools. And if you think about families where they relied on two members of a household working, and one of them couldn't work because there were no opportunities for childcare or kids in schools. And then those who weren't going to work, but where you might be stuck in a small 2-bedroom apartment with 3 or 4 kids 24/7. All of that, plus all of the other implications that flow from it, have had an immense impact on our politics. When I look more carefully and analyze the results of the Virginia gubernatorial election, won, of course, by Republican Glenn Youngkin, in a state that had been increasingly trending blue, while Youngkin's focus, particularly in rural areas in Southern Virginia, on critical race theory and using that race element in the schools was a major factor, the larger COVID factor was even more significant. With the schools especially, the sense that Democrats who had been running the state had said, you know what, we're going to have to close down the schools. Then we're going to have to move simply to remote learning, and without any sense of the disruption it would cause in people's lives, caused a great deal of frustration and had a big impact on the kind of turnout we saw in Virginia. It also did in New Jersey, although the result by an eyelash turned out, or a little more than an eyelash, turned out a little bit differently. And how long that continues as we now see the backlash developing is going to be a very important factor. And obviously, we know that if another variant comes along, that's a deadly variant, our ability to go back to those public health measures of shutdowns, of social distancing, of masking, simply are not going to be doable. And, you know, it's also important to keep in mind that this is not just an American phenomenon. If you looked at the country that perhaps had the greatest success from the get-go in dealing with COVID, New Zealand, with a prime minister whose popularity soared, she is now in a fight for her life for re-election because they didn't follow that with vaccinations. They continued to have shutdowns and other requirements that eventually came to frustrate citizens as well. With all of this, of course, it means that Joe Biden, who has suffered from the consequences of COVID and from the inflation, some of which is related, of course, to the pandemic and the supply chain issues that have occurred, is deeply underwater. and his rating of approval has declined across the board. For strong Democrats, he had a 95% approval rating in April. It's down to 76% now. Those who lean Democratic, who normally behave the same way as the strong Democrats, his approval rating is down to 56%. And for Republicans, of course, it did not start out high, but it has remained low. It went from 13% back in April to 10% now. Now, the tribal divisions have had enormous impact, as everybody knows, on behavior and implications for COVID as well. In a Kaiser Family Foundation poll, among the unvaxxed, 60% identify as Republicans, 70% each as independents and Democrats. Question asked, is COVID an exaggerated phenomenon? The unvaxxed say 88% say yes, exaggerated. Vaxxed Republicans, 54%, vaxxed Democrats, 8%. Is COVID vaccination a personal choice, or does it reflect your social responsibility to help keep others from getting a serious illness? Not surprisingly, the unvaccinated, 98% say it's a personal choice. Vaccinated Republicans, 73% a personal choice. Vaccinated Democrats, 19%. The rest, it's a social responsibility. The consequences are pretty obvious. We see it in a variety of forms, including the prescriptions for ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine, 950% higher prescriptions in a Harvard study for in the 10% of the highest counties that voted for Trump compared to the least. 60 or 150% higher prescriptions for hydroxychloroquine. And as Charles Gaba has shown, 5.5 to 6 times higher deaths in those counties as well. Overall, in the course of the last year, or since May, when vaccinations became widely available in May of 2021, 2.5 to 3 times higher deaths in the most Republican and solid Trump counties compared to the most Democratic ones. Asked about masks, the Democrats say that the greatest burden of COVID has been on the families. The Republicans say that the greatest burden of COVID has been the masking that's been required. And 77% of Democrats, compared to 45% of Republicans, are concerned that they might spread COVID to others. So we see that behavior has been different and outcomes have been different as well. On the economy, let me say, what we have here is a kind of anomaly. We have seen tremendous growth in the country in the last year and historically low rates of unemployment. But obviously, inflation, which hits people on a regular and daily basis, has had its own implications for the distemper that exists in the society. But at the same time, we know, and economists have just recently shown, that inflation did not eat up all of the gains in income that have come in the past year. And we know that there's another enormous anomaly in Gallup's polling. When asked if they're satisfied with the way things have been going in their own personal lives, 85% of Americans now say, yes, they are satisfied. That's a pretty dramatic change from what we saw a year or 2 or 3 ago. But when asked if they're satisfied with the way things are going in the country, only 17% say that it's going well in the country. People are doing fine themselves. In fact, in many cases, better than they thought or better than they had. But they don't see this reflected in the country as a whole. There are lots of reasons for that, but I don't have time to explore them right now. We know that the highest levels of personal satisfaction are among those who attend religious services on a weekly basis, and the lowest level of national satisfaction comes, not surprisingly, among Republicans. For many years, of course, what we have seen is that people view the sense of the economy in the country very much through the prism of their tribal identity, When Trump was president, Democrats thought the economy was doing terribly, and it started out badly for Biden with Republicans. But as you could see from the numbers, if only 17% of Americans think that things are going well in the country as a whole, that's reflected even with those differences across the board. So what are the consequences for all of this? Well, we know that we have this enormous and continued strain on the healthcare system that comes from the continued need for hospitalization. And even if it has not strained every part of the country, or isn't right now the way it did before, it is in lots of parts of the country. And we're still seeing all of the consequences that flow when you have emergency rooms and many hospital wards taken up with those with COVID, which means a delay in not just elective surgeries, but also in some cases in other kinds of emergencies. We know that the costs are much, much higher. We're spending a great deal of money to try to ameliorate with COVID. But what we're also seeing, and what we have seen, is this enormous strain on the workforce. And even as we saw early on with COVID, this tremendous set of problems in the restaurant and catering industries, for example, where they had no ability. I mean, they had, of course, closures for places that couldn't have outdoor seating. We had the requirement to have many fewer tables used. And then we saw a dramatic drop off in restaurant and other kinds of service workers, dissatisfied with the jobs and having been laid off or forced into fewer hours, deciding that they would look for something else. We are seeing a similar phenomenon and will, I think, for a substantial period of time to come with those in the healthcare world, and especially with nurses and others working in hospitals where they've had long hours, tremendous tensions, having to deal with the PTSD of seeing people die in front of them, with the inability of them to have their loved ones close, and also facing bile and worse in many cases from families and from those coming down with COVID. How long it will take and what resources will be required to fully staff up in the healthcare system is one of the great challenges that I think we'll see with hospitals, with health plans, and elsewhere. We know that we have this tremendous strain on mental health. This is something that happens with every pandemic. It is there with depression and anxiety, with PTSD, with the dramatic increase that we're seeing in suicide, suicidal ideation, and suicide attempts. We also know from the past that we're going to see a spike up in serious mental illnesses like schizophrenia that comes when you have those added stresses. And we'll see that with a younger population as well, unfortunately. We also know that we're going to have great difficulty, as I suggested, with future mitigation with pandemics. Even if we don't have another outbreak related to variants of COVID, there will be another pandemic coming down the road, and the public health measures that are taken under these circumstances, including vaccinations, social distancing, masking where appropriate, are going to be much, much harder to implement. And we see this continuing fight against vaccinations and masking. And what we're likely to see in schools is some disruption, some of which has been occurring as teachers and other workers in the schools have been unable to go back. But we're not going to be able to rebound from this very quickly and go back if those are necessary. And of course, what we're now seeing is a spirited set of attacks on all vaccines. And we're seeing in some states what will likely be legislation and executive action to take away the requirement for vaccinations for diphtheria, for polio, for measles, and other things in schools and elsewhere. And we're likely to see then a spike up in illnesses and what will flow from that, which will put an additional strain on the healthcare system. In a larger sense, obviously what we're seeing now, the response to Ukraine, the support for Putin that we're seeing from many counters, including from former President Trump, former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, from people like Tucker Carlson and others. All of those things and what we're seeing in actions in many states poses a great challenge to the fundamentals of democracy in the United States, as we're seeing in other countries as well. We are going to see and are already seeing a greater difficulty in passing and implementing legislation. The administration now is looking for an additional sum of money, $30 billion or so, to continue to have mitigation of the pandemic, with a push on vaccines, likely to include a second booster, with supplying masks that's getting pushback from inside Congress. And as we look towards 2022 and then towards 2024, as we look back at what happened in Virginia, as we know from what happens in history, without a dramatic turnaround in events, Democrats are on a path to losing a majority in the House. The Senate is a little bit different. They may be in a slightly stronger position there because of the seats that are up. And we know that Mitch McConnell, the Senate Republican leader, whose major goal is to win a majority in the Senate, is uneasy about the path that his party has taken on democracy on January 6th and even on COVID, fearing that that might bring a backlash in some of the seats where they will be vulnerable in places like Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and even in Ohio. But if Republicans win a majority in the House, where the choices for Speaker would be Kevin McCarthy and Jim Jordan, not to mention their noodling around the idea of bringing in Donald Trump, since the Speaker doesn't have to be a member of the House, but where the promise is of hauling Democrats up on their abuses of January 6th, doing investigations of Hunter Biden and the like, that there will be an inability to pass basic fundamental bills, including what might bring us more gridlock and possibly even defaults and pretty bad things. At the same time, we have to look at where the Supreme Court is. We are on the verge of having, if not the repeal of the ruling in Roe v. Wade, the effective end to the availability of abortion in many states and huge restrictions in others. We're likely to see a curtailing the leeway of federal agencies to act without the explicit authority that comes from legislation. And while that will have more of an impact in areas like labor and public safety, and it will affect health safety, as we've seen with some of the rulings involving OSHA and others, it will have broader implications for health policy as well. It wouldn't surprise me that now that you have a different makeup in the court, that we will see more challenges to the ACA before we're done. And if John Roberts continued to show support for the legitimacy of the act, there may be 5 justices with a different viewpoint. And then as we see what the court has been ruling when it comes to religion, the fact that so many hospitals in the country have a religious affiliation, the ability that they will have to decide what things they will cover, what ailments or conditions they will be willing to deal with, is likely to lead in more disparities in the availability of services provided to those who need them. At the same time, let me just end by saying we're seeing radical policies in many states as well that will add to the disparities that are out there. Just to pick one example, Mississippi now has a move, and what is a credible move, to end the state income tax, a state that already ranks 49th or 50th in so many categories. And we are, I think, going to see a backlash to expanding Medicaid. So even though the American Rescue Plan expanded health assurance availability to a large number of Americans, the availability of services that will be there for them is likely to be curtailed as well. Fasten your seatbelts. We have a rocky road ahead, even if linear projections might not always fit. And now I'm open to questions and comments.
Thank you, Norm. I don't know about others, but I'm feeling particularly optimistic about our country's ability to exist for at least another 6 months. So let's move to some Q&A. As a reminder for those of you with us today, please send any questions you have for Norm over using the Q&A box, and we'll get to just as many as we can over the next 20 or so minutes here. Norm, I do want to exercise moderator's prerogative and ask the first question. I was struck by something you said at the outset, which is you were kind of making this distinction between polarization and tribalization. And if I absorbed it, I heard you say that polarization, a democratic system can function when it's polarized. When a system becomes tribalized, it becomes impossible to work. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about some of the structural reforms, maybe pick your top 2 or 3 that would allow this polarization, which seems kind of natural and ingrained in people, to express itself without tipping over into the dysfunction that comes with tribalization. Does that question make sense? Whoops, you're on mute.
Unmute now. It does. And let me note something that I mentioned the last couple of times that we were able to meet as well, that we do have larger structural challenges that go beyond our current dilemma. We are close to a point where 70% of Americans will live in only 15 of our 50 states, 50% in 8 states. And that means further skews in the Electoral College, which means presidential elections where the winner of the popular vote loses the presidency, which will undermine legitimacy. This is if we have elections and fair elections. But it also means that 30% of Americans will elect 70 of the 100 senators. And they don't reflect the diversity or the economic dynamism of the country. And that also is going to challenge our legitimacy. The House, we're already seeing now both parties avidly pursuing pretty dramatic gerrymandering plans. The House districts are increasingly homogeneous, reflecting one viewpoint, the sense that the framers had that the House at least would reflect those public views. Public views on issues don't translate now into policies. So what could we do? Well, if I were to put a couple of things at the top of the list, one is I would love to enlarge the size of the House of Representatives, which effectively has not changed since 1910, when it was effectively capped at 435, legally done so in 1930. And we have, of course, larger districts, which means the representatives are not as close to their citizens. But if we added, say, 150 members to the House, we would reduce the skew of the Electoral College. But if we combined it with multi-member districts and ranked choice voting, we would likely get more moderate candidates running and have more heterogeneity in the districts, and that would be a help. Now, there's only so much we can do with structural changes. I would love to get the Australian system of effectively universal voting and move us away from manipulation of the process to keep people from voting, and especially one where you try and suppress the other side's base while scaring your own base to turn out, which adds to our tribal tensions. But I would also love to get something different from structural changes in our politics, which is a universal service. It doesn't have to be the military. It can be in any number of areas. If we could take kids at 18, 19, have them serve for a year or two, pulled together with people from different communities and different backgrounds, get this sense that you're giving back to a society to which you owe something, that might reduce the tribalism. Just to reflect for a minute on the polarization, you can have dramatically different views on policy, but if you recognize that there's a big problem in the country, you can find some kernel of common ground and then do some horse trading, recognizing that you've got to take some action to help solve the problem. You can put in that famous phrase, long forgotten by Lindsey Graham, country over party. And that's what we're not getting right now. And structural changes are not a panacea, but they're almost a necessary, if not sufficient, condition.
Thank you for those thoughts. Several questions coming in now in the Q&A, which I want to get to, and just a reminder to our audience to keep those coming. This is a question, maybe specific around some of the polling data that you cited. Someone asked states that there's a fraction of more moderate Democrats who seem incredibly unhappy with their Democratic leaders' approach to closing schools, other social issues like homelessness and crime. What research has been done on this segment of moderate Democrats, and what are you expecting from them in the midterms?
So we know that is a reality. We know that it's there among some of the elite Democrats. We've seen people like James Carville speak out about the party's obtuseness when it comes to some of these issues. We know from some of the polling in Virginia that while it didn't have a huge impact on turnout among Democrats overall, there were a number of Democrats frustrated with their own party's response. And I think with a reality here, that the lack of any larger public sense of empathy with the traumas that families faced because of the disruption from COVID has had its impact. And it hasn't changed the party identification of those Democrats, but it's altered their enthusiasm level. And that has huge implications for the election. Now, when it comes more broadly to the survey research, though, Christoph, I have to say there has been a whole lot more focus in surveys on Trump Republicans than there has been on moderate Democrats. And I think for the Democratic Party, which also knows that it's facing some real challenges with a base of the party that they'd assumed was all theirs, Hispanic voters, which showed in 2020 that it's not the reality anymore, that it's a much more varied population than Democrats had taken for granted. That poses a big challenge to them. Now, I'd mention just one other thing, which of course has been a reality for a long time and has added dramatically to the polarization that we have, which is that when you come up with these midterm elections and with others, the vulnerable members, the vulnerable Democrats right now are the moderate ones. They are the Alyssa Slotkins of Michigan, the Abigail Spanbergers in Virginia, the ones that come from districts that if they didn't vote for Trump, gave a substantial percentage of votes to Trump, that are more heterogeneous. And those, and of course, what we're seeing with Republicans who have defied Trump or their own leaders, Adam Kinzinger, partly gerrymandered out of his seat, but understanding that he's not likely to win in a primary, who's retiring. Several of those who voted to impeach Trump are leaving, they're retiring. The moderate ones tend to leave, and it's those who are more at the edges in the party who tend to come from safe districts and who come back. So that's a real challenge that we have and difficult to deal with without fairly substantial structural changes, but it also requires a change in mindset by those at the top, including in the White House.
Is there, on the, don't mean to take us back to structural changes, but there were several comments or questions around kind of the shortcomings of having just two political parties. Do you see that as a shortcoming? And if so, how can it be addressed? How do you get a viable third party? And if not, why not? We're well served by two parties.
I do not believe that a parliamentary system gives us gives countries any kind of panacea. And we see that with the responses in many of those to COVID and in other ways. But the fact is that most parliamentary systems provide opportunities for third and fourth parties to develop, to win seats in their parliaments, and then to form coalitions. And right now, if we had a parliamentary system, I think it is very, very likely that we would see a number of mainstream conservative Republicans and probably many more conservative Democrats who might move to a third or fourth party. And the parties would then have to scramble to figure out how they could build accommodations. It wouldn't be a dramatic change, but it would provide a home. The problem that we have, frankly, is that in our political system, the ability for a third party to take hold and actually prevail is extremely limited. If you don't have a regional base in a political system where elections are mostly, the technical term is first past the post, whoever wins a majority, or in some cases a plurality, gets elected and there's only one. There's no proportional representation. And remember that 90% of Americans identify either firmly as Democrats or Republicans or lean in that direction. You're not likely to see a third party that gains more than a handful of seats in the legislature, which is a prerequisite to really building a base for a presidential run. But with the Electoral College, the best a third or fourth party could do, the best a third party could do, is force the election into the House. You're not going to win a majority of electoral votes in this system. You might win a plurality, or you might win enough that nobody gets a majority. And in the House, of course, they vote for president by state, 50 votes. You've got to win 26. And they're going to go by the political coloration of the state delegations, which means if you run as a third party, you're going to elect a Republican as president. If you somehow got elected under those circumstances, you're not going to have any adherence in a Congress and you won't be able to govern, but you're not going to get elected fundamentally without significant change in the political system. Now, there's one reform that would make this a little easier and a little bit better, and that is ranked choice voting for president. Look at what third and fourth parties have done in presidential contests. They skew the results. That's what Jill Stein did and Gary Johnson did in 2016. Winning more votes, Jill Stein did in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan than was the margin for Donald Trump. If there had been ranked choice voting, most likely those Stein voters would have had as their second choice Hillary Clinton, and it would have made a difference in the outcomes. And you could say, go ahead and run as a third or fourth party, make your position known, but you're not going to end up skewing the results to turn it over to somebody who is your least favorite or wouldn't be in your top list. That could be done by the actions in individual states. Most have not done it. A few states have. Maine has it now, for example. Alaska is building it in. But even there, you're not going to see a third party that would be an effective contender for winning majorities in Congress or winning the presidency.
So I promise we're going to get off the structural questions after this, but they do keep coming in. Several folks mentioned or had questions around political funding and the influence of lobbying by corporations and political action committees, et cetera. Do you locate some of the problems in our political system to the current campaign finance structure? What are the changes that you're looking for, and do they have a snowball's chance of happening, anytime in the next couple of years here?
I do think the campaign finance system and the money system contributes very significantly to the dysfunction and the corruption in the political system. Now, I confess I had a significant hand in the set of reforms that the Supreme Court approved in 2002, known more widely as McCain-Feingold, but that were blown up by Citizens United and subsequent decisions. Big money and dark money are extraordinarily important here. As Senator Sheldon Whitehouse has shown, the dark money had a lot to do with the election of many radical judges and with what's happened in the Supreme Court. I'd love to see changes. Without a change in the makeup of the Supreme Court, we're not going to see much happen there. The ability to bring in many more small donors to at least work against the huge donors was in the For the People Act that appears to be going nowhere in Congress. Now, I will say, just as a caveat here, that it doesn't always work. Peter Thiel, the libertarian billionaire, has put at least $10 million into the Senate race in Ohio to get his favorite candidate, J.D. Vance, the Republican nomination, to succeed Rob Portman in the Senate there. And Vance is polling somewhere around 5 to 6%. Money doesn't always govern everything, but I can tell you from 5 decades of being immersed in Congress that money has a big impact on what gets on the agenda and what amendments get approved and which ones don't. And it's a factor we have to deal with, but it's an uphill battle for a significant period of time to come.
Uplifting. Norm, there's a question here around, around getting over some of this tribalism, or perhaps advancing some of these structural reforms that you've talked about. Do you see a potential, is it possible that there's some unifying event out there that would change the tribalism? Folks had mentioned in the past, world wars seem to have done that, but obviously a pandemic doesn't seem to have done that. Is that some sort of exogenous shock to the system? Is that needed? And would it do anything?
I'm skeptical at this point, frankly. I mean, even looking at what's happening now with Ukraine and the Russian aggression, things that normally bring parties together and people together to support the US against our adversaries, now divided along very different lines than we've seen in the past. I actually believe that if we had another 9/11 tomorrow, remember after the first one, at a time of enormous contention in our politics, remember the 2000 election took 36 days to decide. George W. Bush won because of a partisan alignment on the Supreme Court, a deeply divided Congress. He did not win the popular vote, but the country rallied behind him, and all 535 members of Congress gathered on the steps of the Capitol the next day to sing "God Bless America" to show our unity. If that happened tomorrow, I think 250 would be back in their offices writing impeachment resolutions. The only thing that might make a difference is if we had something like the Independence Day movie with alien forces coming in to destroy and cannibalize the earth. Maybe that would do it. But even there, I'd be a little bit skeptical. It's going to take us some time before we can move beyond this. And let's face it, Christoph, when you have media and social media operating the way we do, that reinforce these divisions and give people different sets of facts as they believe them, that will make fewer distinctions between what's true and what is not, that will have us even divided on common sense public health grounds. This is not something that's going to end anytime soon. We can only hope it will be ameliorated if and as COVID disappears, the world becomes a little more stable, and the economy continues to move in the right direction with inflation dampened. All of that might help. It might cause these things to recede. But we know from other societies that once you move in a tribal direction, it is very, very hard to move beyond that.
Norm, in our last couple minutes here, and then we'll turn things over to the panel. I want to preview, some of what they'll be talking about and get your thoughts on what the leaders in the audience might expect from the federal government and the federal policymakers specific to healthcare over the next year, given this tribalism that you've spoken about, and given the pressures of the midterm or the reality of the midterm election coming up. You mentioned in your talk, some of the work the feds had done around help for the healthcare workforce. You mentioned needs around, pronounced needs around mental health, disparate access to physical health. There's a lot of issues there. Notwithstanding everything you just talked about, the challenges, what is really likely to be coming out of Washington over the next year or so, specific to the healthcare system?
So we did see, after all, a substantial infusion of money that had a real impact on the Affordable Care Act and the availability of insurance with the American Rescue Plan done at the beginning of the Biden administration, although done through reconciliation on a partisan basis. We saw the possibility of a significant additional infusion of money in this regard if some version of the Build Back Better plan had been implemented. There is still some possibility of a pared back Build Back Better plan. What we also have to keep in mind is the disconnect between some of the realities on the ground and the views of many of those, including Democrats in Congress. When the child tax credit went down, we saw, when it was implemented, we saw a dramatic decline in child poverty, which of course we know also has its direct implications for health availability for children, and also for the early childhood development. With the demise of that program, we have many, many millions of children who are back in poverty, and that will have its implications. If we don't get universal pre-K, if we don't have some way of dealing with childcare, that also will have its implications for health and for the workforce. I think looking decades down the road, there is a chance of that happening in the next few months, but the chance grows slimmer by the day or week. And remember, if we, as we move further down the road towards midterm elections, if Democrats believe that their majority is either in jeopardy or likely to go down, the willingness to enact policy will become harder when you have a margin of 4 in the House and no margin for error in the Senate. And there's almost no likelihood of bipartisan cooperation in many of these areas. I do think that we have some bipartisan support for changes in policy towards mental health, but we know we're going to need a substantial infusion of resources in a system that already is overburdened, has many, many fewer health professionals able to deal with especially problems of serious mental illness, but we don't have the resources available to deal with any kind of crisis, including what I think is not going to be an ability to expand the number of beds to deal with mental health issues and crisis. As depression increases, what that will do to the workforce and whether we will have policies or the resources to cope with them, even though you have people like Roy Blunt and Tom Cole joining Democrats like Debbie Stabenow and Rosa DeLauro in support for common sense policies to deal with mental health. It becomes harder as we look down the road. And, let's keep in mind that unless there's a dramatic turnaround in our politics, the ability to deal with these issues now is greater by far than what we're likely to have in 2023 or 2024. So in a lot of ways, people in the healthcare world are going to be on their own. They're not going to be able to rely on continuing infusion of cash from the federal government. In states, we're going to see wider disparities. There are some states, and let's face it, because of the money that's come from the feds, we have surpluses in a lot of states. If they use some of that money to ameliorate some of these issues in the healthcare system, and of course, people have mentioned homelessness, a lot of which is linked to the mental health disparities and problems in the country. But there are going to be other states that will refuse to do so and will have these continuing issues and disparities. And it's likely to hit as hard or harder in rural areas where the disconnect between the services provided, the challenges that they face, and the political attitudes and viewpoint is most pronounced.